start going our way through the agenda. Agenda item 1 is apologies. We've got an apology from Paula Bradley, who is, I think, away with another committee. Any other apologies? No? Okay. Agenda item 2 is declaration of interests. Again, members know by now, if you have any relevant interest to declare, do so now. If not, move on to agenda item 3, draft minutes of the meeting held on the 28th of May. I refer you to tab 1, which is page 4 of your packs. If you want to quickly glance your eye over the minutes from the last meeting and indicate if you're content for me to sign. Okay, everyone happy enough? Yep. Okay. Okay, agenda item 4 is review of the Code of Conduct. You'll be aware that the Northern Ireland Government Affairs Group were due to be here to give oral evidence today. However, they had an AGM last week, and following the election of a new chair and committee, they have decided they will no longer be giving evidence to us. We expect to receive correspondence from them clarifying their position, and perhaps some of their individual members may wish to come along and brief the committee in individual capacity, but if we get anything, we'll then decide what we want to do with that. So today, our only briefing is from the Equality Commission, and that will proceed as planned. If you want to go to page 10 of your packs, you'll get the briefing paper from the Equality Commission, page 18, and the committee's issue paper at page 31. Again, remind members that in our issue paper, the committee acknowledged that the law in relation to discrimination applies to members and urge members to perform these duties scrupulously, as they would do for any other legal duties. However, the committee went on to say, I believe, the Code of Conduct should not give the impression that the current existing principles of equality and promoting good relations create duties specific to members above those set out in legislation. The Equality Commission is an independent, non-departmental public body established under the Northern Ireland Act 1998. They provide equality of opportunity. They promote equality of opportunity and affirmative action and oversee the effectiveness of statutory equality duties on public authorities. So with us this afternoon, Dr Michael Wardlow is Chief Commissioner and Roisin Mallon, Senior Policy Officer. They will be giving evidence. So anyone got any questions before we invite them in? Are we happy enough to proceed? Yeah. Happy enough to proceed? Okay. Okay, Dr Wardlow, Ms Mallon, very welcome to the committee. So if you want to just formally introduce yourselves for Hansard, and then
yes, absolutely.
Introductory comments, and then we'll facilitate questions, if that's okay.
Yeah. My name is Michael Wardlow. For the last 2 years I've been the Chief Commissioner for the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland.
Roisin Mallon, I'm a Senior Policy Officer with the Equality Commission.
Well, thanks very much for allowing us to come, and I thought what might be useful, we've obviously given you a sort of fairly detailed view and brief. What we thought would be useful is if we literally spent up to 5 minutes each simply highlighting some stuff. So I'm probably going to cover leadership, a little bit around free speech, and a little bit around the equality and good relations principles. Sure. And then Roisin's going to maybe look into the wording of principles, the equality and the good relations principle, and maybe a little bit around what we feel about the enforceability of rules, if that's okay. Yeah, perfect. There are lots of other things, obviously, we're more than happy to engage with you. You know, the public-private debate and so on, we're happy to come up with that. Okay. I think we feel this is a really important thing. I'm really glad that you're taking this opportunity to engage with people and listen to a whole range of stakeholders, because for us the code isn't simply a rule book. I mean, it is that, but it's not simply that. And there's a sense in which when you talk to members of the public, there has been over the last number of years a growing challenge function around, you know, I'm involved in other stuff and governance is very high, accountability, probity is very high, and I think rightly so. But it's not simply, if you like, this rule book or this set of restrictions. This is much more around, for us, aspiration. It's around trying to lay, if you like, this way ahead for this united community, and this is what leadership looks like. These are the aspirational principles that should underpin it. So we think this is really important. And the Standards Matter report that was brought out, I think you've read, obviously, and I know you've taken some evidence from the US. It's all sort of saying the same thing. Ethics are extremely important. I mean, how we do stuff, what's at the DNA of how we do stuff is as important as what we do. So I think that's the context that we want to talk to you. Although we'll talk about rules, we're trying to say that in a sense is the foundation. We're saying it's rules plus. So that'll be it. So that brings me into the area then of leadership. And I think we've said very clearly that we need to be sure that the members who are elected here provide a model of effective, democratic and good, positive leadership. And, you know, when you talk to people around, that's what they're expecting from the people they elect. Not just here, by the way. I mean, they expect it of me in my public position, and I'm always aware when I take decisions as the chair of a board, but also there's something around trying to model good leadership. And therefore, those who have a significant leadership role need to be champions of, in our view, equality, and that's the promotion of the equality of opportunity, not simply reactively defending something, but it's proactively promoting. And that ties in, as you know, very much to the Section 75 duties, which, whether you feel they're good or not good, they actually set us apart from a lot of places where they put a requirement in public bodies, not just simply to react to, but actively promote both equality and the good relations. And there's a great quote from me about standards of behaviour, very short quote from the public life section of the Standard Matters. It says that high standards of behaviour are necessary to be understood as a matter of personal responsibility, embedded in organisational processes and actively and consistently demonstrated. This is about demonstrating competence and leadership over a period of time. It isn't simply a skill set you carry with you on a CV. We're saying this should be demonstrated and capable of being seen to be demonstrated in what you do by all individuals in leadership roles. And therefore, even if a behaviour or a language doesn't constitute a breach of the code because the words were maybe said privately or casually, what we're actually saying is it's not about a set of rules to catch people out. And obviously, the report in GB said sometimes people use the code to avoid stuff. Well, we're actually saying that when you have when you understand significant negative and detrimental impact that inflammatory language and behaviours can have. So it isn't simply enough to say, can I do enough to pass the code? Although that's important. It's actually saying, does the code set some aspirations for what good leadership in this situation would be? And that's not forensic. This is actually case by case, so that there aren't any absolutes except the principles that we want to talk about. We get into then the second issue, which is around free speech, and there's been a lot of debate and discussion. Happy to engage with some of that. But I think what we've said publicly, and I've said when I've been interviewed, there is a misunderstanding that freedom of speech is unfettered. It is not true. We know it is fettered by, for example, obscenity laws, by libel and slander laws, and by generally in the United Nations and international human rights, it's about the principles of do no harm and offence. So something in here means we've got to have a discussion that says what would free speech look like, and just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. So there's something in there that's going on, and therefore what we're looking for is that people act in a way that doesn't offend those underlying principles. So it's not simply the set of rules, but it's the aspirational principles. So that leads me to the final bit that I want to deal with, which is the principles of conduct, particularly that obtain to equality and good relations. And these need to be, and we'll be consistent in this, they need to be clear, relevant, concise and understandable. There's no use having airy-fairy stuff that, well, what does all that mean? We have Nolan principles, and the Nolan principles actually go beyond requirements. So there is obviously a precedent already for those in public office who have signed up to Law Plus. And we're simply saying, when we're looking at what we're looking in this code, we're saying, yes, of course, the law, yes, of course, regulations, yes, of course, the equality and the international human rights standards. But we're saying there should be more than this. So there should be this need to actively promote this good relations in this equality context. And therefore, the Section 75 duties, obviously that's one of the things we want to be linking this to. But we also know that you have signed off on the Together Building a United Community. And frankly, we're moving beyond orange and green. We're looking at how we might actually actively promote a united community, not communities. And how, although there is still sectarianism, there's still lots of stuff between the two main traditions, we're increasingly becoming a more diverse society. Like just under 5% now of people who live in this place weren't born here. So that says something about what those equality and good relations. We've got to therefore see the code requires members to act for the whole of the community. And therefore, the importance for us to have principles and not just rules were not only made clear by the Standard Matters, but also because sometimes if we don't have those principles and we simply react to what the regulations are, there can be a restriction. But sometimes principles allow us to lift and get a vision, get an idea, an aspiration of what good leadership would be. And therefore, adherence to a code of conduct might not necessarily, in every circumstance, provide for a defence of poor behaviour or good behaviour. So there's something going on between these aspirational principles that should draw us up and the foundation principle of the regulations that should be clear and concise and able to be determined. And therefore, you know, what this surrounds us, and this is my final point really, is that the code should be encouraging members to act in a manner that proactively requires them to seek to challenge prejudice and promote understanding. So the negative, if you like, the looking back is stop prejudice, challenge it when you see it, but more importantly, creating this aspirational leadership that actually shows what good relations should be.
Okay, just following on from Michael's comments there, I'm going to turn to the actual equality and good relation principles that are currently in the code of practice. We feel that a number of changes are required to those principles relating to equality and good relations. We believe they need to be clarified, they need to be strengthened and amended so that they more accurately reflect the types of behaviour that members should aspire to. At the minute, we don't feel they adequately do this. So I could turn first to the equality principle. In terms of our recommended changes to that, you'll be aware that currently the wording talks about members promoting equality by treating people in a certain way. We're saying that there's an amount of ambiguity in that, and we're suggesting that the wording of that principle is amended to read, you should promote equality of opportunity and not discriminate against any person treating people with respect regardless of race, age, religion, etc. So it changes to the wording in terms of by treating. We think that's not clear. In terms of the good relations principle, we're also recommending some changes to that. You'll be aware that the current wording in the code talks about acting justly and promoting a culture of respect for the law. Again, we do not feel that that accurately reflects the proactive nature of the good relations duty. Now, we recognise that neither good relations or promoting good relations is actually defined in legislation. We had set out some, or a form of words in our guidance for public authorities on what we meant by promoting good relations, and you'll see that in the paper. It talks about promoting respect, equity and trust and embracing diversity. We are currently considering a revised definition of good relations in the context of the Together Building United Communities strategy. And in coming to a proposed wording, we're also looking to what is happening in Great Britain under the Equality Act, which talks about tackling prejudice and promoting understanding. Although we do not have a final definition for the committee at this stage, we are happy to further engage in it, but we do ask the committee to look at focusing on the need to tackling prejudice and promoting understanding between people on a number of equality grounds. But we will come back to the committee in terms of our updated position. So I just want to turn then to enforceable rules. It was very clear in the issue paper that the committee was of the view that in order for principles to be meaningful, there has to be rules that explain how these principles apply in specific circumstances. So we are recommending that in addition to the principles relating to equality and good relations, that there are also enforceable rules that are directly linked to those principles. We have given one suggestion in the paper in terms of the equality principle. We recommend the inclusion of an enforceable rule that makes it clear members must not discriminate on any equality grounds or act in a manner that is in breach of hate crime legislation. Now, we're also recommending consideration to the inclusion of an enforceable rule directly linked to the principle of good relations, but as I say, we are still looking at a revised position, and that's why I can't give you an exact formulation on the wording of the enforceable rule, but we will come back to the committee on that. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a couple of questions just before I open up to other members. Both of you, I think, spoke about principles, not just rules, and about aspiring to, I think the words was aspiring to what good leadership would look like, and members should aspire to a particular type of behaviour. And then you talked about enforceable rules linking to the aspirational language. But the two examples that you gave about members must not discriminate against individuals, members, but hate speech and things like that, they are already prohibited.
Yes, yeah.
So Some of the advice that the committee has had before is that there's no need to restate those in our code, given that it already is the legal position that members cannot do that. If members were to engage in that kind of behaviour, there already are laws governing that. Do you think that there is an issue with restating existing law, given that some of the legal people say it's bad practice to do that? Or do you think that it's so important that you would need to restate it?
I mean, there is an issue about, well, I think there are a couple of things. This is a public document, and there's a sense in which we should be stating in that the types of things. And the other thing we didn't touch on, but it's in the paper, once you get the code, and I mean, it would be my own personal view that I think it is very helpful to state that this is the legislation, the anti-discrimination legislation plus the hate crime. And I think to name those doesn't diminish what's out there. And in fact, if anything, reinforces it and holds it up. I don't think you're running contrary to any legal precedent by having it in. But for us, we actually said, once you've got that code, there's something else has to happen. And that is that we would be looking to maybe to work towards developing guidance alongside it. And that guidance might show indicative examples of what things might look like that you could and couldn't do to help colleagues. But then it would be tied into training and induction. Because, you know, in other places when you're doing good relations, everybody thinks they know it, and then suddenly something comes in and you're really looking for the code to find can I or can't I. So we thought that if it's stated there to say, well, we all know this stuff, this is the baseline, but we're restating it lest it be, you know, and if new legislation comes in, of course you can update it and whatever. The more important thing for us is to say that's there needs to be some form of regulation tied in to see if outside the law you have, you know, crossed the line somewhere. But what we're saying is, I think that these high-level principles should then be drawing us up, and you've already got the Nolans of selflessness and integrity and so on. Now, we know that it's very difficult to put a test for integrity. I don't think we're suggesting you have 27 new regulations tied to each principle, because that just wouldn't work. But I think that the trick is going to be how you use the principles to draw you up, and how within the great principles governing equality and good relations, you get something that allows you at least to test out through a regulation whether or not people were actively promoting good relations or equality outside the actual well-trusted and tested. Look, the legal field is full of tests on equality. Quite frankly, there are very few on the good relations, to be fair. You know, we know what reasonableness looks like in equality legislation. Good relations, this remains a lot to be tested, and this is going to be on to buck something when we're looking at the good relations indicators. So this isn't just something you're going to be struggling with. So I think, Alistair, we're saying, yes, we don't think it diminishes. In fact, we think it elevates it by having it in. Okay. If there was a legal ground coming from someone, you know, my professor of law saying it doesn't need to be there, well, I would defer to that, but certainly our view would be rushing.
Yes, I just to agree with Michael, and also to say, I mean, the House of Commons code, you know, does specifically say members must not discriminate, so they have pulled it out as a separate, you know, duty, even though it's clearly within the equality legislation in Great Britain. And we mentioned in the paper in Wales, which is it's a local government code of practice, so not quite the same, but it also has a clear enforceable duty, must not discriminate. So we see there's value in having an overarching principle followed up by an enforceable rule.
One of the other things that you said was that members should be champions of equality or champions for equality. No, West, absolutely members shouldn't be discriminated against people, and shouldn't be you're discriminating against individuals in their job. How exactly can a member be a champion of equality? I mean, how can you have a code that imposes a duty on a member to be a champion of equality, particularly, I suppose, in circumstances where perhaps you could envisage a circumstance where a member has been elected on a platform that perhaps they're not, or not perceived as promoting equality, and that is the platform which they have democratically been elected for. So how could the code actually impose upon that member a duty to be a champion for equality?
I think, I hope I said equality and good relations. If I didn't, please make that for the record, because it certainly wasn't just equality. Look, I think this is in the aspiration. We're saying, and this isn't about equality in one particular area, you know, whether it's disability, gender, LGBT, sexual orientation stuff. This is saying that when people look here and they're looking at a code, what they're not looking for is simply a set of rules that say, here's what you work within. They would, I think, what we hear back is, and we would certainly like to see, here's your aspirational principles. Now, it's not saying this is your working definition of equality. You're already bound by anti-discrimination legislation across 6 characteristics anyway, so that's already there. Yep. But we're saying how you work is promoting good relations and equality. what you're standing on. In that sense, you're modelling and being a champion. We're not saying you should be going out advocating for one particular issue on equality, although by all means, if that's in your mandate. But we're saying that this is an active call to do that. A bit like 75(1) and 2. It's not simply enough to make sure you do the law, but the requirement we put on the public bodies through the requirement that was put on was to work towards the promotion of equality of opportunity. In the same way, we're saying you should be working towards the promotion of equality and good relations.
It's not easier to do that with a body, a formal body, than it is with an individual who, frankly, we have 108 members here, all with different views and things. It's not easier to have a corporate body with that duty upon them than it is with an individual. Maybe you don't.
Well, we obviously are in our place, and the Human Rights Commissioner there, and there are other bodies, that do certain bits of discrimination law. I think we're saying if we look to the MLAs who are here as leaders who have been elected and are meant to be setting the vision for this united community, and you've already said in your own preface to the united community, this is built on fairness and equity and justice and all that. We're simply saying to restate, well, if that's the case, if that's the aspiration in the programme for government and in Tabuk, Together Building United Community, then that needs to be evidenced in what you say and do here. So it's not individual champions, 108 running about. It's actually saying that's sort of, if you like, the DNA, the rock, that if you broke it open, that's what you would see written on it. Is that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think just to sort of tease out the difference between promoting equality and not discriminating. The rule is what the law is in terms of do not discriminate. The principle we're suggesting is more aspirational, goes beyond just don't discriminate. It's actually saying promote equality, promote good relations. And we're saying that, as Michael has mentioned, links into the existing duty already on public bodies to have due regard to the need to promote equality and good relations. We feel members can promote equality, not just not discriminate, but can promote. They can promote inclusion. They can, for example, encourage participation in public life of disabled people, of of women. That's going beyond just not discriminating. That's actually taking proactive steps that encourage others to go beyond simply not discriminating.
I think, for example, the publishing this week of the race strategy for consultation is an absolute way on which you're championing equality and inclusion. Those are the sorts of things, whenever that became a united launch, as opposed to one party putting a stamp on it. And of course you will do your own things, but I think when that happens, do not underestimate the power that has to set a model out there. And lots of people aren't voting, lots of people are saying, well, this, I don't need to tell you. But when this happens, it really does send a signal of modelling effective, good leadership. And that's, I think, what we're saying here. We're not saying there should be a test, he said X or she said Y, they failed the test of promoting good relations. That's not what this is about, to catch people out, but it's trying to say, how do we put people beyond the law? How do we say, if you like, it's legislation plus? And we've done that, for example, in workplaces. Workplaces are now doing lots of things they don't necessarily have to do because they see it's a good thing to do. Diversity brings results and productivity. Incomers have added about 0.5% to GDP here. We know that that's actually happening. So I think that's, Alistair, what it is. So no, it's not about setting somebody up and then there's a test or they fail the test.
Yeah. And in terms, just finally before I open up the other members, in terms of the freedom of speech issue, and obviously it's of particular interest at the moment, I don't want to go into any specifics, but it is an issue, and it has been an issue for the committee, I think, over the last number of months. There's been a number of issues that we've had discussions, and that freedom of expression, freedom of speech issue has come up, and perhaps it's dead easy when somebody has said something that's not controversial to say, yes, we all support freedom of speech. It becomes increasingly difficult when somebody says something which is perceived as offensive or damaging to good relations. Do you believe that the code should go beyond stating the legal definition of freedom of speech? I mean, obviously there are freedom of speech is not absolute. There are caveats there in terms of incitement to hatred and things like that. Are you of the view that the code should go beyond where the legal position of freedom of speech is?
If you want to answer that in terms of our response, and let me pick that back up to some of the stuff we've been trying to say over the last couple of weeks at a more strategic level, maybe. Yeah,
I think you're quite right. Freedom of speech is not absolute. It is qualified both by criminal law. It's qualified by which includes hate crime, includes public order offences. It's qualified by equality law, and it's qualified by human rights legislation. So there's a whole a lot of restrictions on freedom of speech. So what we've said is that nearly in a sense what's already reflected in the code, members should be free to express any political opinion that they hold, but not to do so in a way that offends the underlying principles relating to equality and good relations. We agree that the wording must be compliant with the human rights legislation, and we know there's a tension already, and it's set out in the issues paper, between to what degree members can express political opinion and yet still not be manifestly contradictory to the principles. But what we're saying is we agree it should be compliant, but whenever you're looking at the wording to ensure compliance, we want you to take a proportionate approach to striking the appropriate balance between permitting members to express a lawful political opinion, yet expressing it in such a way that does not offend the underlying principles.
Well, let me give you an example. I mean, without naming stuff, let's take interfaith dialogue that I've been publicly speaking about recently, and I think we should have more. I think the churches should be engaging much more with other faith communities in that. I've been brought up to understand that a faith tradition, a religious belief, is open for discussion and debate. I've had really strong debates with colleagues from other traditions, both Protestant, Catholic, and then beyond the Christian traditions. And I'm quite open for people to say, you know, your belief system is terrible, and have that robust debate. Absolutely, freedom of speech is all over that. The issue then is, whenever you then take that and somehow build something up and predicate characteristic on a group or a race, so and so can't be trusted, or whatever it happens to be, that I think then moves beyond what I would understand as speech and expression. Now, in the same way as someone comes to us and say, is this discrimination? We don't make that call. That's for the courts or the tribunal to make. We can't say whether something is or isn't freedom of speech, because in fact that's just the International Court. And in fact even our colleagues in the Human Rights Commission are looking for some guidance from the UN on, in the current position, what does constitute, you know, freedom of speech. I do think you're going to have to struggle with this, but it's always for us, the big principle is to do no harm and cause no offence. Now, you do not have the right not to be offended, and make that clear. But just because you can say something to offend doesn't mean you should. So if you're then saying, here's your set of principles that says the regulation, the rules that say the things you can and can't say, that allows, you know, for the match to go on in the middle. But if you then have an architecture that's three-dimensional that says, well, you know, the other things that guides me are, am I, by doing this, simply expressing freedom, or am I in some shape or form damaging good relations or equality in the bigger sphere, not to do with the rules and regulations, but to do with the building a better community. And I do think that's one of those balancing acts that I walk, as you walk all the time. Sometimes we say things casually we don't mean, and then we apologise for them. Other times, you know, we say something because it pushes people's buttons. I think what we're saying is this debate discussion is around what would that debate and discussion look like, so that I'm not closing down your right to freely express what you believe by saying, oh, hold on, you're going to offend me. And I think until we get to that place, so I think as Roisin said, whatever you do in defining this, make sure that the cornerstones are around proportionality, and that the international human rights law is there, if you like, as your foundation. But that shouldn't be seen as some sort of straitjacket. Heaven help us if we can't have a robust discussion. But there's something around here about how does that done. And I know you've a cut and thrust up here that will be very different if you're outside, and that's fine. But sometimes when that transfers itself outside, just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. So I think it's about that. That's the modelling I was talking about.
Okay.
So I would hate to see here's a definitive forensic definition of freedom of speech, which we keep going back to see if we break or not.
Yeah.
This is the difference between regulations and principles, I think.
Okay. Ian?
Yeah, I suppose goes back to one of the part of the question that you were referring to, Chair, was around these enforceable rules. And I'm not sure that I probably accept that, you know, enforceable rules, not, you know, I believe, yes,
Sure.
rules should be within the code. There should be, you know, things that members have to accept. The issues that the Chair related to in respect of those that are currently within the law,
Yeah.
I'm not sure that we should, and I suppose that's my own personal opinion, that we should state those, other than it may be something that we should do around just reference certain aspects of certain laws within it. But have you any examples of, other than the Wales that you referred to, where they used the enforceable rule of discrimination, have you any other examples of where enforceable rules are used in other places in respect of the discrimination and good relations and equality side of things? Is there other examples you can give us in respect of that?
Is the new district council code not have?
No, not at the minute.
It was being discussed there, wasn't it? Yeah.
We have responded to the DOE Code of Conduct for councils and councillors, and have also recommended changes to the wording on equality and good relations, because clearly there is a crossover in terms of clauses there. So we've raised concerns with them in relation to that.
So in essence, is it just it's a Northern Ireland thing
No,
because
I
of the good
understood.
relations?
I wanted to
thing,
make
you
sure
know,
that we
is-
have already said something into the DOE debate,
Yeah.
which is
Don't
exactly
worry,
that line.
I'm on the DOE committee, so we'll get that there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well,
So is there another
No, I
jurisdiction
mean,
that
it's
you're
the
aware
only
of?
ones that I'm aware. If you're talking about a code, the only one I'm aware of is clearly the House of Commons does have the statement they must not discriminate, and the only other one I'm aware is in the paper in Wales, that local government code, which is also makes it clear there's a duty not to discriminate.
Is your concern, because Ian, about restating, or is it, I mean, whether they're there restated or not, they're there, if you know what I mean, then colleagues know. And our point was simply by being there, it's a reminder and it's a reinforcement. It's not adding anything extra to people's responsibilities. Is your concern about...
I think the one focus certainly I have, and I think most members have, is, you know, the code that we have is, you know, we're trying to reduce it in size and take, you know, some of the unnecessary stuff out of it that's already, certainly those things that are already in law. Do we need to have them restated within that? If there are things that are already in law, and the Chair's already referred to it, why should we restate them in our document when that is the legal definition? Anybody, you know, that has a query around whether we have lived up to those, you know, will have their opportunity to test those through the court. But I suppose it's probably more so around that I would sort of see that, you know, why do we always have to add more? You know, some people use this suggestion less is more, and it's probably more so around that.
So let's imagine again, because I'm not a lawyer and I'm not technical, so just imagine someone is referred because they breached the code. At the minute, that breach is held against a regulation, as I understand, or of course criminal law, if it happens to be that.
Well, it can be manifestly in conflict with the principles
Yeah,
as well,
yeah.
the conduct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you didn't have the regulations and someone was referred, the point at which then they would take as a baseline presumably would then be the law as it exists. So, and I don't know if that diminishes the ability to test someone whether or not they've breached something if it's not stated there. If you're saying this is about brevity, you know, I think, you know, we're simply saying, you know, nowadays with electric stuff, most people are going to have this on something that's electric or a PDF or something. And we've said we think it should be there for the reasons. I think it's up to you if, in terms of brevity, you want to reduce that, as long as what it doesn't do is diminish the ability that you have, if it comes to the test, to see whether or not someone has in effect breached. I think that's the bit for me.
Yeah, I think, I mean, part of the reason is also the committee itself has said if you're going to have a principle, then you should have an enforceable rule linked to it. So we're saying, well, clearly you should have equality and good relation principles, and therefore you should have corresponding rules, because as I said, the committee has recognised there's a need to link rules with principles.
Just for absolute clarity, I don't think we've said that if you have a principle, you have to have a rule corresponding. I think what we have said as a committee is that we want to see perhaps a separation between principles and rules, and the principles would be potentially aspirational, and we recognise them as aspirational, but the rules are the enforceable bits.
Yes.
I think that's where the committee has come from, and perhaps that's why we've had a number of discussions about this over a long period of time about how we want to have a very simple and straightforward code.
Yes.
And that's maybe why some members feel that things shouldn't necessarily be restated if they're already the position in law. And there's also the case, of course, that if we were to go beyond where the legal position is, that is challengeable in the courts. And we know from other places in the United Kingdom where members have been found to have breached the code of conduct, but have then taken that to court, and they've been found actually the decision's been overturned because they haven't actually broken any laws. I think we're also
I think what
cognizant
we
of
were
that as
saying,
well.
Alistair, was you're already doing that by signing Nolan principles, because Nolan principles aren't in that sense legally binding, but you still assent to them by, in some way that that's the direction of travel. And we're saying that these aspirations are in the same way taking you beyond the law. Now, no one is saying that, you say something and, we need a regulation to tie that down, that he or she has breached a regulation on good relations by doing X, because that's back to this simply being a set of rules, as opposed to being, of course, a rule book, but more than that being, if you like, an aspiration manual.
Yeah.
So I think what you're saying is, for brevity, if you're going to leave the regulations out, I mean, that's your call, as long as what you're not doing is limiting how you're able to hold someone to account for breach. I think that's fair. And that's illegal, and some legal view will have to be taken from your end on that one.
Okay, Cathal?
Thanks, Chair, and thank you very much for your presentation. The first question I'll ask, give me the definition of good relations. Start from there. I don't think it's brevity. I think we want a clear and precise code, because we've noticed, especially over the last number of weeks, the types of complaints that are coming in and being investigated. And I just want to use the example of, you keep mentioning equality and good relations, and I just want to put this to you now. I don't want to use a specific case, but I'll refer to an issue where a public representative goes out and acts in a manner to protect their community. So in essence, you could look at it as an equality issue, because they're representing those people. And in turn, then turns around a situation where it gets them into a wee bit of trouble. I mean, so, if we look at it in them terms, we need to strike the balance between protecting the member and what they're trying to do. And we'll not get into the law, because law is about meanings, and it's a whole minefield of stuff, and I want to leave that aside.
But just, Cathal, to be clear on the first bit, there's a very simple definition in 2010 Act in Britain, which is saying, basically tackling prejudice and promoting understanding. Now, one of the things we've said into the new TBUC is you could do worse than just take that as a very simple. So that's actually saying actively tackle prejudice and actively promote tolerance. I know you were playing with it.
No, I'm familiar with it. I mean, and we'll get there in the end, but it's key. I mean, we've heard, and I do appreciate the presentation today, because it's opened up another minefield for us in terms of what we want to go with this here. But there's a couple of points I do specifically want, and everybody's mentioned enforceable rules. In terms of, you mentioned them themselves, in terms of equality and good relations. Is there any other enforceable rules that you think we may need to introduce or anything, or have you responded in relation to that?
Other than is already in the code?
Yeah, and which, how do we think about that? But the other question I want to bring up is the issue of, and I was interested in the issue of personal and private lives.
I was going to say that one.
And in what circumstances, is there a public interest to justify such an intrusion into members' personal life?
Well, we've dealt with this in quite significant detail, so let me just be as brief as I can. I'm a public representative too, and as soon as I tweet or go on my Facebook, I'm Michael Wardle, Chief Commissioner of the Equality Commission, no matter if it's private or not. So I always take the view that whenever I do anything in the public domain, people will confuse me. Now, I'm very nervous in that, so that's the rule I take. What we've said in the paper is, you've got like two circles, and in the middle there's an intersection. So this is me, and I have a public and a private life. The bit in the middle is hugely grey. So we're saying that your private life doesn't start the minute you walk out of the Assembly building here. And we're also not saying that every time you say something, you're a public representative. So there are ways in which that grey area in the middle can be tested. And whether you use the reasonableness or presumption or perceptions, I mean, we've advanced some of those things in there. But we think if you're moving into the area of private life, it's not enough for somebody to say, that's private, leave it alone, or for somebody else to say, everything you say is public. So some negotiation in the middle of that. But if you are going into someone's private life, it needs to be proportionate. It needs to have the benefit of public good. It also needs to be clear that it holds up and is held up by the international human rights standards. So you've got, if you like, a field here that's fenced in. And if you want to go into this place that's called private, you need to be sure that when you go in, there's a good reason to do it. You've just cause. Also that it is in the public interest, but also that you're not interfering unnecessarily or interfering with the international human rights standards. And most importantly, it's proportionate. Now, that's well accepted and standard out there. Now, that's not saying you shouldn't do it. We're simply saying if you choose to say, now I know in Westminster they have a comment that says you shouldn't be investigating personnel unless such conduct significantly damages the reputation and integrity of the House of Commons as a whole or its members generally. That's almost nuclear. You know, it's sort of saying, somebody says something, I don't know, go on Celebrity Big Brother and then say something really stupid about the House of Commons. You could see how arguably that may well be them then invoking the code. So they actually have a determinant there of what might constitute private intervention. But we're saying to you, first of all, what is private? And that's something you need to look at. Is it reasonable? Is it presumption? Is it perception? And secondly, if you're going to go in there, make sure that what you do has sound legal advice, has proportionality, has the public interest in it, and is superintended and held up by international human rights standards.
But on the point that Cathal makes there, I mean, I listen to your point. There's a grey area, I think, and everything in life there's a grey area, and those who don't see grey area probably don't quite understand the challenges that we face. But in terms of the grey area is covered by, well, if you bring the House into disrepute. I mean, again, it leaves us the challenge, what does that actually mean? Because the whole idea of the principles is, well, what do they actually look like in the real world? And we want to make things as easy as possible for, ultimately it's the Commissioner who will decide whether or not somebody's breached the Code of Conduct. So the whole idea of disrepute or bringing the House into disrepute,
But I think that's what we've
where
said,
is the
Alistair,
test for that,
about
right?
the guidance. I think what we're happy to work with you. Now, what we've done in other places is give examples of what in the workplace might promote a good and harmonious workplace and what wouldn't. So we help people develop worked examples, because people actually learn by the examples. So we'd be very happy, and others, I'm sure, to work along with you to say, well, look, this is the sort of stuff that might arguably bring you into disrepute or cause problems, and therefore avoid it. You know, so don't go fishing here. And that's one way of doing it. So along with the regulations in your code, you have, if you like, a guidebook. But then that would need to be training or induction at least, you know, an ongoing like CPD, because rules change, you know, and I might say something on a Twitter and then withdraw it, and suddenly my tweet's still all over the place, and we've seen that. And the other thing is the rules have moved, you know, what you did in 2008, social media has moved on dramatically since then. And, you know, you've got from everything from pictures to the spoken word to the innuendo, and you can't say for all time forensically this is what brings it into disrepute, but I think it is possible through training and through guidance and working with ourselves and others that we could actually help together. We could help you look at that one. So it wouldn't be just so grey.
Sharon, just with your indulgence, just another point, and I mean, you mentioned you responded to the councillors, right? And I think there's a good opportunity in terms of the community plan element
Absolutely.
of looking at that, and I think we shouldn't miss that. But my point in saying, we haven't really got down to the bones of it in terms of the public view. There's a public expectation out there that we should represent them and act in such a manner. And I'm just wondering, just your views in terms of maybe even this case, not case law, but case study that we can look at that'll bring us forward here to developing a good code, you know what I mean? But in terms of how you've dealt with public cases, general public, what we can incorporate in as you know, as to do something with this code.
Well, it's fascinating because, you know, our top three, we have over 3,000 phone calls every year, and out of that we have about 300 applications for support, and we support about 100. And the top three consist under race and gender and disability. They're the top three. And when you then talk to people, and you find a lot of this is because people are not, it's not just about the law, but it's about how people actively promote good working relations. So reasonable adjustment is one of the biggest ones for disabled people. You know, a chair, you know, talking to people about what would you like, what would you expect. So I think what you're saying is right. I think there is an engagement process here, because you'll get 27,000 different views on what you should be doing. But I think there are some key things that people would expect from public elected representatives, and the guide may well help that. But I do think it's useful to engage and sort of say and work through some examples. And we've done that in a lot of other areas. Employers would do that regularly with us, test stuff out with us.
But we've also done it with public bodies. I mean, we have our guide on promoting good relations for public bodies, and we said this is the type of things you could do to promote good relations. So we've given clear guidance. So, you know,
And that's feedback, by the way, so that is evidence-based. That's not just us thinking.
No.
That's when people come forward and say, well, yeah, I went to that district council, look what they did to me. So we're feeding that back and saying, because everything we're trying to put forward will be evidence-based. And I think, well, absolutely, if you want, we'd be very happy to work with you in that as well, to develop that. You know, it'll not be a forensic guide, but it certainly will help you say, this is the type of stuff. And that's a growing thing as well. You know, that'll, as it grows, I think it'll build more, not just where you are, but with the new public bodies as well out there.
Thanks, Chair.
Stephen?
Thanks, Chair. Thank you. What would you say is the role of this committee?
Today or in future?
Well, I suppose we're looking at the future. What should the role be?
Look, you know, if you end up just as a judiciary, almost, you know, it's a bit like sort of the internal reviews on the police or something else, you know. Look, of course you've got that sort of role, but there is something about the aspirations, the drawing up, and I think if you are able to set a code in a context that says, look, this is what we actually think leadership in this new place we call home, however we refer to it, it looks like. And, you know, if as a mature society we're building a united community and we're signed up to that, this is what we would expect of our leaders, and we are going to help model that. So, of course, you have the forensic nature of calling people to account and reminders, but if you were able to say, this is important enough that there should be like CPD in this, people should be required to have a top-up on this on an annual basis. There are lots of people who help with that, and I think what you're then doing is also building up this residue of having a challenge function. Of drawing people on and helping to say, here's what the principles are. The other thing is commend good practice. I actually don't think there's enough of that. I think we could do well in commending. And one of the things we do more and more is commend good practice. We've just published a guide of best practice in disability. And people opened it up. I didn't realise by doing this I could. And it's the best kept secret. I think there's some brilliant examples of good practice within the Assembly and what you do. Absolute brilliant stuff where you've worked together and it hasn't been orange and green, it's been common cause. Disability is one I can think of in there. And there's others. And I think those are brilliant exemplars and the members of the public need to know it. So maybe you've also got a bit of a job there, doing a good bit of PR there. The other thing is listening. I think if you can listen to what you've said, Cal, about what the great unwashed are saying or what they expect. So if, in a sense, you're able also to be a bit of an eyes and ears, that also allows you to sort of be like the heart, you know, the heartbeat.
Yeah, no, I mean, clearly this is a really significant role of the committee in bringing forward a robust code. We see it's absolutely key, extremely important. So it's a clear task, and of course your role in investigating complaints. And you know, I have looked through a number of you know, the outcomes of some of the complaints. And you know, what has struck me is that sometimes you actually even say, yes, although this didn't breach, you know, the member just needs to be cautious and act in a reasonable way. So you've actually not just said it's not a breach, you've actually gone further, and I think that's been really helpful as well, your own views on a particular complaint as well. And I think, as Michael said, just highlighting good practice is another role that could be enhanced. Yeah.
And I think if you, and you have done, this is beyond party politics. You know, I'm not, and have never really heard party politics in this, and I think if this happens, it actually does send a signal that, you know, we may be orange or green or all colours in between, but we actually can pull together for the greater good. I think that is a huge thing, and I think we need that. And I think you've shown that leadership. And, you know, the problem is it doesn't leak outside the walls here. You know, it doesn't get out there.
You mentioned leadership a lot, and I suppose what I'm trying to understand is and we struggle with sometimes as a committee, is where is the role for us as a committee in terms of, well, one, enforcing standards, but also with the code setting standards, and how much is the role of the electorate? So some of the things you've talked about in terms of, particularly in terms of promoting equality, I think yes, absolutely. And in terms of leadership and those good relations, we talked about prejudice. You know, I would view the views of some parties as being prejudiced by their nature. It's not, to my view, it's not our role to direct the policies of parties.
No.
That's for the electorate. So I suppose what I'm trying to work out is, yes, we can set the aspirations, but how far do we go in that terms of promotion of things we think of are good? And even if you talk about TBUC, that's a political policy, albeit it's an agreed one by and large. I have certain issues with it, but it's a consensus one, maybe, best way to put it. But it's a political decision, and I believe this committee should be apolitical. So would you not have concerns that in some of the things that you've outlined we're actually starting to take on?
No, you see, I don't think so, because let me give you an analogy from a previous life. In integrated education, when a new school was set up, there were 6 foundation governors elected. And in fact, they weren't elected, they were the foundation governors who set the school up. And as that school grew, 25, 30 years on, Lygon College still has 6 foundation governors, and they in a sense retain the right to challenge the others on the foundational principles on which the school was set up. They in a sense are the ethos, the core. Now I see in a lot of similar role for this committee. You embody, or should embody, through the code, the ethos of what makes this place work, and the core and the ethics that the raising standards and others have talked about, because and these are common. The Nolan Principle picks off the 7, but there are others as well that we can add. So if somehow you draw people back to those apolitical, common good principles, I don't think you go far wrong. Now, the danger, of course, is people come to us sometimes and say, will you ever tell us, should we do this or do that? And we say, no, we don't take decisions for you. We give you some parameters within which you take the decision, and then the democratic process takes over. So you know that better than I do. So you can only add and help add value by your comments and by showing good practice, but what you can't do is superintend or override the democratic process. Stephen, it's not easy, but I think, and it's not, but we and other bodies are very happy to help how we can. If we have to be bad cop or the good cop, happy to do that, but I think that's a good working relationship we would look forward to.
Just to say, Stephen, on your point, our views on the principles on quality good relations, and Michael's mentioned this earlier, they are consistent with Section 75 duties which the Assembly agreed that public authorities must have. So by asking members to promote equality and good relations, we're saying this is consistent with an Assembly that has already placed a duty on all public bodies to have due regard to the need to promote equality and good relations. So that is why we're saying it is not a big leap to ask members to promote equality and good relations when Assembly's already passed laws saying public bodies must.
I think the
have regard
difference
to that.
is, and where people get confused, there are 3, 6 and 9 protected groups, if I can use the shorthand, and people get confused. Section 75(2), the good relations, there are 3 groups. Section 75(1) has 9 groups, and the anti-discrimination legislation covers 6. So when we're talking about promoting good relations, the anti-discrimination legislation we talked about earlier covers the 6 groups. But if we're then saying, well, what about the 9 groups under Section 75(1), which includes marital status, I think, and dependents, and there's a third that I can't remember at the minute. So although there's no protections under the anti-discrimination legislation, we would expect that you would do that. So that's an example of law plus I was struggling for earlier. And that, there's no reason why I wouldn't have thought you wouldn't have wanted that in there, because we've signed up to it under Section 75(1). So that's the sort of stuff we're saying to remind people. And if you're saying, well, we think this is important enough to profile it, but to also say you should be trained on it, and here's the guide, and you should consistently be trying to feed in good examples. I mean, there's a political thing in this too. If within your party there's a really good example of a worked way in which good leadership has been shown, there's no reason why that doesn't travel. It doesn't have to be something that's sort of so apolitical, it's only the lowest common denominator. You've got some good stuff going on here, really good stuff. It needs to get out there.
The issue of offence, arguably, as you said, there is no right to not be offended. Challenging of political views. There sometimes will, by its very nature, be almost offensive. And I think of issues like flags,
Sure.
where if you come down strongly any one way, someone will be offended, even if you haven't expressed yourself in an offensive way. Again, how far is that for us to judge as a committee, and how much is it for the electorate to judge? If it's within the law, obviously. We've had some examples even of where one member's called another member by sort of juvenile name and whatever. That's offensive. Some people would say, well, it's cut and thrust political debate. How far do we go? And again, a lot of the time we come down, like if that's per leadership, per representation, well then it's up to the electorate not to re-elect these people. It's not for us to say.
I think ultimately you're right. The electorate will have their say, but let me give you a personal example. I grew up in a tradition, cross-community tradition, so I had lots of friends. I happened to be perceived Protestant, so I grew up with a lot of people who were Catholic. My Catholic friends used to constantly refer to me as a non-Catholic, all the time. Until once I took one aside and said, I am not a non-Catholic. That's a bit like an atheist saying there's somebody who doesn't believe in God, and my atheist friends say, don't call me that, call me something different. Now, was I offended, was I not? But I dealt with it with that individual. But he says, well, hold on, you're a prod. And, sometimes your people say the Pope's the Antichrist. So we got into this debate about what was offensive. And it was a fascinating thing, because we had a friendship for 20 years. We'd never talked about this stuff. So part of it is actually opening up some discussions. Because I genuinely think people sometimes offend and they don't mean to. I'm not defending. So there is something we've actually said to open a discussion around free speech. But the other thing is about the challenge function of thinking before you say something. Does it add value? Is it a good thing to do? Is it promoting the common good? That's the high-level principles we're talking about here. And I think that's in a growing society emerging from what we've come out of. I think that is going to be an increasingly hard one for us to struggle with, Stephen. And again, offence is one of those. I don't think you can have this litmus test. When somebody says something, you test it, it goes blue, you've transgressed. Surely the important thing is that then you have a debate around, well, how could that be done differently? Because the only remedy, presumably, is not that he's breached or she hasn't breached the code. Surely it's around having a discussion around how the next time that thing mightn't have happened.
Yeah, but with respect, that's exactly what we're asked to do. We're asked to determine whether or not somebody has breached the code or not. And in an ideal world, the scenario where Stephen outlines that somebody has shown a lack of respect to somebody else, whether that's through actions or language or whatever else, it's not the committee's role to bring those people together and have a dialogue about it. We have to determine whether or not there's a breach of the code.
I'm not saying you act as mediator. What I am saying is that if this comes in and you act as judge and jury and say you did or you didn't breach the code, that's a forensic determination. That doesn't say about whether that has caused harm in the public domain, whether it has infringed the principle of quality. So there needs to be something. That's why I'm saying you're not the answer for everything. The next stage is how you have that open conversation around this shouldn't happen again. What do we do to stop it getting here again? How do we actually promote good and proper and strong principles of leadership? Now, this is out with what you do, but if you're setting the standards around talking about the principles and how you draw people on, I think it feeds to somewhere else now, quite where that debate and discussion takes place. I mean, obviously the electorate have their say, but I would hate to think that's the final one.
Sure, if I can ask one more further question. It's back to the sort of MLA, public and private, and I think you've outlined principles, and I suppose I want to kind of press you a little bit on some practical application. So I think I mentioned outside, I very much believe that an MLA who speaks on Twitter is acting in the public capacity, particularly if they say, I'm MLA for wherever, as their description. So I'd be interested in your view on that, but even another example whereby, say, a political rally. I attend a lot of trade union marches. As far as I'm concerned, I do that as an MLA. Not because it's my job to, I don't think I'm required to, but it's a political act, and I'm elected in a political capacity. I very much feel that should be the scope of the code. I'd just be interested if you would agree that is reasonably perceived to be acted as an MLA.
Let me say something strategically on this, because I think I have heard arguments very recently that there should be a code governing the use of social media, and that it should be an agreed code of what. And you either say it is or it isn't in public domain or not. Now, that's for you. We wouldn't be saying there should or shouldn't be. But I think the longer it remains grey, the longer you will run into these difficulties. Because very few people have two accounts. Yeah. So when I tweet, I've only one account, and therefore I'm very careful what I say. The bigger issue about presumption or reasonableness, I think you do need to come to some understanding about how you're going to determine what is and what isn't said in the private realm. I mean, we've said some stuff there, Roisin.
Well, in the paper we say, look, there's a range of tests out there. You have the reasonably be presumed. You have the DOE code, which talks about giving the impression, which is another test that's out there. And then you have the House of Commons code, which talks about damaging the reputation, integrity. So we've just said there's advantage and disadvantage, so we haven't specifically said which one we feel is right. But we are saying that whatever one you pick, it has to be compliant with human rights, and it has to be, if you're going to intrude into members' life, it has to be proportionate and a clear public interest. So,
But the bit before that is, I say something, Joe Bloggs is an idiot or something, right? And I've said it out in a rally. The first question is, when somebody sees that, do they presume that I'm speaking as a public rep or not? And once they say, yes, I am, then the code. But if they say, no, no, he's not, then the second question is, well, even if it's private, is that of the significant event? So I think the two things we're saying here is, one, you need to have some determinant. I would suggest it should be the same for councils as well as here, because, you know, if you have councils that have a different test than here, it would run you into problems. So whatever you decide, I think it should be across. And then the second thing is, once you make that determinant, whether it's presumption or reasonableness or whatever, you then need to be very, very sure that when you go into somebody's private life, it's all the things we said, proportionate and so on. So, I mean, maybe it would be nice if we said we think this is better. I think it should be clearer for you that you really need to have it across the two, whether that's presumption, perception or reasonableness. Reasonableness has a lot of precedence in law, by the way. You know, there is a legal precedent under Wednesbury case of the definition of reasonableness. So that's there. So there's an argument for that, but then there's another argument for, well, leave that aside. I assumed he or she was acting as an MLA. But then that's a bit like hate crime, it's perceived. So I think it depends on the route that you want to go down.
I think just finally to say that we, you know, whatever test you ultimately come up with, we do agree there should be guidance on it. There should be indicative
Absolutely.
examples of the
And
type
this
of
is the
conduct
guidance we
that-
talked
that
about earlier.
Yeah, so people are clear. And I suppose the other point we're saying that, you know, clearly there can be inflammatory language and behaviour by members which doesn't breach the code. So we're making it absolutely clear that in the guidance you remind members, yes, it may not breach the code, your inflammatory behaviour and language, but it does have and can have significant impact, and so that they're aware of that.
And I think that's a bit we said earlier. It's not just that you're sort of the court here, but you're actually trying to promote actively. You can't hold people to account if they breach the principles, but at least you could actively promote
Yeah.
them.
Okay, Fran?
Okay.
Sure. Most of the stuff that I was going to say has been asked already, but it's just an interesting point that Stephen had raised. You know, when he goes to a trade union march, he goes as an MLA, and what is the perception of the crowd? You know, I'm a trade unionist, and I've been going to trade union marches before I was an MLA. And you have to try and work out that difference. I use a Twitter account, but I do not use an MLA account.
But
So
if you tweeted something from, and you happen to say something about, I don't know, the Assembly, just why don't they get on with X? You know, the perception is likely to be you're an elected MLA, you're speaking about this place.
and I would accept that.
Yes.
But I also tweet a lot of things that don't. But
No,
people's,
absolutely.
But
Like
people's
me.
perceptions of that and what I tweet may see me doing it as an MLA.
That's where
also.
perception falls, you know, because then.
But a lot of this is all to do with perceptions and expectations of people. And you go back to the private public life, you know, you get into these debates and arguments with people who believe that once you put yourself up for election, that you're public property and you have no private life. So it's difficult to think, and there's a whole problem out there where the people that have that perception, you try to explain, well, if I do this, and they were saying, no, you put yourself up for election, and that's honest. And some of this stuff will probably end up, like most stuff, will be challengeable until there's a point of law set against the thing with a description of it. That some of this stuff, that may be the only way that you'll be able to.
Well, the other thing I would
understand
advocate
it.
strongly is that there are already curricular possibilities to do this within schools. And I know in youth work, which was my background, young people learn about civic democracy. So if we started really early in the curriculum and introduced young people to the notion of what free speech is and model that, then by the time that generation at least come up, I think we've a generation now of young people for whom they actually do get this because they've been through civics at school and they get some of this stuff, maybe more than we would have done. That's very clearly one or the other. I'm very hopeful, but I do think, you know, maybe there is something to be looking at social media and its use. And you may come down and say, all social media is fair game if you have your name to it. I don't know, but, you know, I think that's worth looking at.
Okay, Marvin?
Thank you, Michael. Merci, everyone. You talked earlier on about forensic guides, and there's been a lot of talk about being definitive in terms of what it is you want to describe something. We all live in the real world, and obviously we're dealing with a humanity that's flawed, so mistakes will happen, and even your own organisation in the past has had to admit to procedures and practices that weren't seen as being fair and equitable. How do you have a prescriptive definition of actively tackling prejudice? Because I listened earlier, Michael, when you talked about actively tackling prejudice and challenging prejudice, and Stephen made reference to it. But prejudice is defined by different people in different ways: unfavourable opinion, unjustified or incorrect attitudes. But for the person who is making that statement, for them it is something which they genuinely believe. You alluded to one earlier on, which I'm not going into the detail of, but I may hold the same view on that particular issue. Now, is that should I be challenged or pursued because that's a prejudice, or because that is something which I genuinely believe? However, the way in which I express that shouldn't be in any way seen as being offensive to any other individual.
I think, Mervyn, you make a good point, and this is not about thought police, and this is not about challenging people's political or public or private opinion, whether it's theological or not. I mean, that's to be said. The question is around then how you act on that and how you use and choose your words in that. And for some people, they would say it's a preference rather than a prejudice, or it's a choice rather than a prejudice. And at the minute, we don't have a definition of good relations, whereas we have definitions of equality. So that's why I'm saying the law is clear on those things. As we move into the book, we would be actively seeking a definition of good relations in the legislation. At least then we know what that means. Now, once that's there, then there is at least something to hold it against. Now, we're not saying there should be 27 rules or regulations written in which, if in effect define how you would promote or attack prejudice. We're not saying that. These would be part of the operating principles which you're trying to draw people towards. The exemplars that will be down in the guidance are then the sorts of things that are saying, well, you may hold this view, but to express it in this way or in this context wouldn't be the most helpful thing in the world. I think it's about this. It's about behaviour. Look, laws change people's behaviours. They don't change attitudes. And this is not about necessarily wanting everybody to be the same coming off a production line. But laws sometimes are necessary to make sure behaviour is modified in certain circumstances. More important, I think, is to help people's attitudes learn from the other, and that's what the principles do. They're trying to help people in their attitudes, not trying to change, not trying to challenge beliefs. This is about how we might be able to express ourselves to help this place move on. Heaven help us if we close down robust conversation or say you're not allowed to hold that belief. I would not want to live in that universe. And that's certainly not what we're advocating.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, everyone else?
Just, it goes back. We've had this debate quite a number of times, and I think all of us have said at this committee at one time or another that we defend the right of people to have free speech and thing. But it's how you determine when it's grossly offensive to sections of the population, and that's where the problem is.
And there needs to be some test, the same way as discrimination. Discrimination is not always unlawful. So you could give people over 60, free eyesight tests. That's discrimination. You can give young people who are unemployed preference in jobs. It is actually okay. So please, we need to move away also from the fact that discrimination is a dirty word and can't happen. It's the type of discrimination that we've lived with. And therefore what we're saying, of course you need to have some test. And of course that's necessary. But some of this is going to be, it's an art and a science. You're defining through the code the science. And we're saying, but that science should have some art in it, which allows you to move. That's why it's three-dimensional. That's why it's, if you like that, three-dimensional rather than a flat structure. And I guess what we're saying, we present today, we're around, lots of people like ourselves who've worked with this stuff are around, and part of the role is to try to do this together. So we're more than happy to come back to help, if it's guidance, if it's whatever. That's one of the reasons we're here. And listen, just to commend you, I think what you're doing is not easy. But I think you have a real good opportunity to send a big signal. The race strategy site is another opportunity for people to come back, and Tabuk, when it is launched, I think is another one we'll come back maybe and talk as well on.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll go out and tweet now. I think really good.
So as long as it's on your personal account.
I can see 10 new followers to see what I've said now.
Have you checked that you don't have any of us?
Sorry?
Have you checked you don't have any of us as
I know
already?
one or two. Yeah.
We're all blocked.
All the best. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you. Okay, members, we'll move into closed session then for the agenda item 5.
Committee room